At the end of the day, you want your legislator to respond to the people they represent. And so, thinking about ways to, and incumbents are so entrenched and so have such high re-election rates, right? It's hard. That makes responsiveness harder because they're like, well, I'm going to win anyway.
Welcome to Cornhole Champions, a weekly podcast powered by Iowa Starting Line, where we throw bags at the state's biggest stories. I'm Zachary Oren Smith. It's Wednesday, and I'm joined today by Iowa Starting Line's Amie Rivers and Avery Staker. Iowa sent a fleet of Republicans to Congress, but once in D.C., they seem reticent to come back and publicly talk about their work. There's been a lot of attention on Republican leaders who were telling their caucus to avoid town halls like the plague. What's the cost now that Democrats are using them as a cudgel? Come toss some bags with us and hear about bills, good and bad, that are making their way through the legislature, and get a deep dive into term limits and whether they would do what we want them to. That's coming up on Cornhole Champions.
So, Zachary.
Is that how I sound?
So, Avery.
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you know about the company Maverick taking over our beloved Come and Goes here in Iowa, right?
Yeah, the greatest atrocity that Iowa has seen since the Great Depression.
So listen, I just read in Axios that there has been a lot of friction between the Come and Go folks and the Maverick folks because Maverick, of course, was like, we won't change anything. And then like every single acquisition ever, they change everything to be their preferred thing, right? So one of the big things was they specifically told them, okay, we have pizza. We know you guys have pizza. We're going to have a blind taste test. And whatever pizza wins gets to be the pizza that you have. And Come and Go was like, great, let's do it. And they did it. Come and Go won decisively.
Of course.
Decisively.
Of course.
And then Maverick was like, well, we're going to
were they sore
We're
losers?
going to go with our pizza anyway.
What was their pizza exactly?
I don't know what Maverick pizza is. I don't go to Mavericks. But it was clearly inferior to Come and Go. And so I was reading about this. I actually just reposted it on Blue Sky. It was like they actually interviewed like anonymous employees that were in that meeting that verified that Come and Go pizza had won. And Maverick's just like, well, because it's cheaper if they just ship their own Maverick across the country rather than try to do different things. That's all about the bottom line.
I mean, immediate thoughts, I can tell you this. Maverick is a fraud, and they must be stopped.
That's like treason or something.
They should be ashamed. I will sow salt in their fields.
Have you had Come and Go pizza?
That was like luxury cuisine when I was in college, was going to Come and Go and getting the Come and Go food.
Luxury cuisine. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, they've gotten, and Come and Go has like kind of gone, they've kind of gone through the looking glass of the varieties that they offer now. I mean, there's always, I think internally, right, I'm comfortable with the two genders, right, a Come and Go breakfast pizza and a Casey's breakfast pizza, right?
This is Quick Star slander.
This is Quick Star slander. This is
Quick Star erasure.
Quick Star erasure. That's right.
My only feeling is that the three houses, I think, can be fully united in what is a unclean, unwholesome takeover of a beloved tradition, which is the Come and Go, the Come and Go pizza. I'm going to tell you this: you can take the come out of the go, but you can't go.
No,
we're gonna have to beat this.
No,
you can't go.
Restart. No.
Avery said, "Stop right there."
Say something else. Say something else.
You can go, you can come, you can...
Everything is going to be bleeped.
Say something else.
You can...
Say something else.
First story. Amie, you're bringing us the intro to the first story, right?
The hottest new club in Iowa and across the country is the Empty Chair Town Hall. So I wanted to talk about, actually, the popularity of these empty chair halls. First, let's define it. Empty Chair Town Hall. Basically a town hall where your representative and or senator or both doesn't show up, but all of the people still do because they want to talk about what's been happening and yell at someone even if it's not their representative. So these have been happening all across the country. they've also been happening in Iowa. I wanted to start with Zachary and Avery. You went to the one in Des Moines where Minnesota Governor Tim Walz took questions from the crowd. Avery, let's start with you. What was the mood like there? What did you notice from the crowd?
I talked to a lot of people that were in line waiting outside, and I was kind of surprised at some of the it wasn't necessarily like the gung-ho excitement that used to come about with like going to Democratic town halls, but because I did caucusing and stuff when I was in college, and people were all for, there was a lot of like excitement for like the Democratic movement back then. But at this
Right.
one, a lot of people were like kind of looking to hold some accountability for like inaction that they see, especially at the federal level. Tim Walz wasn't going to answer those questions because he's not, a congressional person, but a lot of people were like, we want to know what like the larger Democratic plan is to protect us, because a lot of people are very scared and very uncertain right now. And I was like, honestly happy to see that, because I think a lot of people can relate to that, and I hope that that pressure is felt.
I definitely loved your video, especially with the older couple. That just made my day.
Loved them.
Yeah.
They were so fun to talk to.
People are angry. I mean, people that you wouldn't think would be angry now at the MAGA crowd at Musk just seem really, really upset.
People are mad as hell, and they can't take it any longer. Yeah, I mean, like, I think if there's something that was true about the event, right? It was this kind of moment where a bunch of people they spend their days scrolling, just growing more and more frustrated, just are steaming about what has been just what seems like just a soup to nuts failure of our kind of politics to meet this moment, right? Here in Iowa, I mean, we've seen the USDA get cut like something like $11.3 million from that's already been promised to Iowa farmers, right? That's being cut. That's taking access to local foods out of for some of our schools purchasing. We've seen tremendous cuts at the Department of Veteran Affairs. We've seen through this continuing resolution, concerns about the impact it's going to have on Social Security, on Medicare, Medicaid. I just think there's a lot of us that are just wondering, like what the hell is going on. Now, here's the rub. When a town hall is like kind of, I think of them as like pressure valves, right? It's like a chance to see, like, you go to a town hall in a particular area and you get to see kind of like, okay, this is what's the vibe? Let's check the temperature of the room in Humboldt, Iowa, in Des Moines, Iowa, in Montezuma. And you can learn a lot through these instances, right? And in this one, fortunately, the person that showed up, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, is both like, a person that it's a name, was the losing VP pick for Democrats this past November. In some ways, right, I think there was like some folks that just really wanted to see the guy right there. I think he was pretty popular leading up to that election. But I think there was just this like sense that like we really want to speak to our representative, right? We really want to get a chance to have our concerns heard by the guy that we elected, that's in our seat.
Zach Nunn, right? Yeah.
Representative Zach Nunn of Iowa's 3rd congressional district, but he's nowhere to be found. And I think here's one of the challenges. Right now, if you talk to Zach Nunn's office, right, they'll tell you, oh, where Zach Nunn's, every time there's a recess, Zach Nunn's in his district talking to Iowans about their needs, their kitchen table issues. The problem is his office isn't holding public events, and they're certainly not advertising them ahead of time, right? I think just as a matter of democratic hygiene, right, I think we need to get back to a place where we stop having these canned experiences, right, where, where Zach Nunn will, at the last minute, be added to the, Urbandale Rotary meeting agenda, right? Where he can, get questions asked and answered right there on the spot. I think that leaves the most of us most of us who aren't in power, who aren't in these rooms, in the dark, and unable to, kind of make our needs, make our concerns known.
I want to ask about what were those concerns. I guess, Avery, what were you hearing as some of the top issues that people were talking about?
Well, some of the questions that were asked had to do a lot with healthcare, education stuff, mainly stuff that I know Representative Nunn has come under fire for most recently. I think mostly just as kind of like to counter those policies and views that he has. But at the end, Governor Walz called out and said, what are you most worried about? What do you want the Democrats to do? And people in the crowd were like, be more aggressive, fight for us, stand up for trans rights, protect public education, tax billionaires, try to break down some of the partisanship, or at least attempt to. And I thought that was really interesting because, again, it wasn't like, do more of this. It was a lot of pointing out kind of the lack that people see, which I think kind of goes with what Zach was talking about earlier. But I think almost more than people are frustrated with current representation, what they're doing. I think another point of frustration for a lot of people is they don't feel like they have anyone else to turn to. And I mean, especially here, because we're a majority Republican district, or majority Republican state. And I think people just don't feel heard among Republicans, but they don't feel supported among a lot of Democrats too. Which I mean, it's hard for us to tell that story in full because none of our major representatives are Democrats. But I think that was a really interesting part of the town hall to see. And I think that was cathartic for a lot of people too, because these frustrations can be pent up when you're just sitting at home scrolling.
Yeah. Two things, right? One, I think it is super valuable for as we become more mediated, as we become more isolated, people are thirsty to be in person, to share an experience, and whether that's frustration, whether that's joy, right? We want to do things together, right?
Yeah.
And I think these kinds of events, I mean, why are you saying J.D. Schulten had a 3-hitter in Sioux City, Des Moines, and Davenport that had great attendance. Hundreds of people showed up to each of these venues across the state with very little notice. There was one in Cedar Rapids that had filled up a theater. I mean, people are hungry to show kind of this. I think it's Walz called it a primal cry, right? It's in response to what's happening, this sense of rudderlessness. And for Democrats looking to speak to this, right, when you talk to folks, Avery, you said one of the things you heard during that quick answer session was Tim Walz was a person saying, be more aggressive, right? I think there is baked into the pie of Iowa politics this sense that we need to be genial, we need to be observant, we need to be cordial and reverent.
The Iowa nice.
It's the Iowa nice,
Yeah.
and I understand it.
Yeah.
I understand cordiality, right? And I don't think manners subtract from bravery in that way. But I do think that there's this reticence to show the emotional intensity, right, that I hear from these people in confidence, right? But when they get in front of the camera, when they get in front of a crowd, suddenly it's sterilized in some way. And I don't think it's necessary anymore. I think people are hungry for something real. If people are hungry to feel things with other people, and a leader that could plug into that, I think will find purchase, I think, with these crowds.
Show some more emotion. Be a little more vulnerable.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I think that's why I was talking to a friend about this the other day because she asked me about the town hall and how it went. And if, I told her about the strategy of how the GOP said that they're not going to be holding that. That's their actual strategy is to not hold these, almost obligatory meetings that you're supposed to have with your constituents. So then the Democrats are now kind of sending their leaders into the most, the districts where they see they have the most chance. And she was she's somebody who I talk to her about politics all the time. She's not
Right.
as aware of everything as I might be, but she was that sounds smart to me.
Right.
And so, and that her saying that just kind of put my finger on the pulse of people are going to see this as a message and being able to express your frustrations and have them heard, not just through an email, I think that's really going to resonate with people. So not only is it going to be an opportunity for like these Democratic leaders to show that emotion and show that aggressiveness that people want, I think it's also a way for them to, there's like a tangible reference that people can make to, this representative was in the room when I said this out loud and I had a mic and they were, listening to the speakers. Like it was, they couldn't ignore it. They couldn't just have a clerk respond to your email. And I think hopefully that, hopefully that kind of, that messaging is what the National Democratic Party sees, and they use that for fuel.
And I'll say for anybody listening who's going to these events, I would love to hear from you. Write in, Zach at iowastartingline.com. Tell me kind of what you're experiencing. Are we right? Are we speaking to what you're experiencing, or maybe there's something else that's bringing it out? We want to hear from you. So please write in. And because we want you out, we want people out and about. We want people getting involved in their local parties, getting involved in their local towns. Amie, are there any other events coming up where folks can get involved in this way?
Oh, yes. I was actually just sent this super large list by Charlie Wishman, and I've been also sent others by other folks. So thank you to everybody who's also been emailing me about these. Tonight, in fact, Wednesday at 3 p.m., there is a Nunn town hall at Des Moines Public Library. When we say these representatives' names, it doesn't mean they'll be there. They probably will not, but yes, Des Moines Public Library at 3 p.m. Tonight at 4 p.m. in Indianola at Miller Meeks' district office. Tonight at 6 p.m. in Dubuque, there's a Hinson Forum at the UAW Hall. And then this Thursday in Iowa Falls, there's another one where Hinson, Ernst, and Grassley were invited. Friday, there's a Grassley Town Hall in Franklin County Courthouse at 9 a.m. Saturday, Creston, Council Bluffs, Iowa City, Waterloo all have town halls going on. So please go look up some more information. I've been posting it on Blue Sky as well. If you follow us there, please do. And yeah, so there's definitely one in your corner of Iowa. We'll
plan to put information on these stops in the show notes. So if you want to come, you'll have all the information you need to participate.
Give them that website.
cornholechampions.substack.com. Thanks for the tea. Second story, I've got an update on a story from last week. You'll remember Amie and I had some fun talking about the Iowa Republicans' chemtrail bill. I have this clip.
The bill would ban the emissions of air contaminants into the atmosphere to intentionally alter the weather. Iowa's Environmental Protection Commission would have to adopt rules to enforce the ban on geoengineering, which is the intentional manipulation of climate systems on a large scale to counteract climate change.
We should also ban Sasquatch. We should probably also this is how far down the rabbit hole Republicans have gone.
That chemtrail bill is still alive, and an amendment was filed. Representative Adam Zabner of Iowa City amended the bill to require a, and I quote, Bigfoot study. The Department of Natural Resources shall conduct a study to research the existence of Bigfoot in the state and shall submit a report to the General Assembly on January 1st, 2026, containing the department's findings and recommendations. That was a real amendment filed after our episode went live, and I'm going to go ahead and claim this one as a victory for the show. That's impact journalism, baby. That's...
Do we know if Adam got it directly from the show? Have you reached out?
He claims, the representative claimed to me the other day that, that these two aren't related, but I'm, that won't stop me for taking credit.
That's right. That's right.
It's on record that you thought of it first.
What if we actually find Bigfoot?
Even better, what if we discovered what the hell happened with the Van Meter visitor?
What is the Van Meter visitor, Avery?
You don't know what the Van Meter visitor is?
What are you talking about?
Oh my God. Okay. So picture, it's like 1923 or something. I don't actually know what year it happened.
That sounds right.
It was a long time ago, but the citizens of Van Meter are going about their day in their little, early 19th century Van Meter village. And all of a sudden this big figure lands on top of a building.
Winged.
And it just sits there. It's winged. It's got wings.
Oh my gosh.
And it just sits there, and it's got these glowing eyes, and it's just surveying the civilians of Van Meter
Multiple people saw it over multiple days.
over multiple days. And it's just surveying, it's just looking. And then it flies off, never to be seen again.
So it's got eyes, it's got wings.
Yeah.
What other, like, is it a bat?
It's the Van Meter visitor. Nobody
is it a
knows.
crow?
It was
Nobody
like
knows.
human size, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was like human
Or
sized,
bigger.
and they just said winged, and then I think glowing red eyes or something about the eyes. People were like, the eyes were. But yeah, it is like it's Iowa's own cryptid story.
Yeah, we actually have that story up on Iowa Starting Line, so you can
We do.
go search for that there. But yeah,
Oh, 1903.
1903. Yeah.
It was a very good year for cryptids.
I know. Okay, so yeah, it looks like it's like a almost like a pterodactyl looking thing. Like do you know what a pterodactyl looks like?
I mean, I've seen the bones. I know more about the there's a Pokemon called, what is that? Pterodactyl. It's like
Well, it's probably not called the dinosaur. They probably changed the name a little bit, right?
Aerodactyl, actually. So
Aerodactyl.
they did kind of just call it the thing. So in your face.
I wonder if you can find one of those in the Pokemon Go game in Van Meter.
I wonder
Whoa.
if you find it, you have your information sold to the Saudis.
Oh.
Did y'all
No.
catch that?
Is that one of those? No.
Yeah, Abu Dhabi backed
Them
firm
and Monopoly
buys.
Go.
Sucks
Oh,
sucks to
no.
suck. Do you guys have a favorite cryptid? Obviously, Avery's is the Van Meter visitor, which incredible.
Well, okay, he's not my favorite, but I do enjoy that story because I think it's funny that he just came, parked it on like a furniture store, and then just left.
No doubt.
Like I think that's hilarious.
Avery's obviously in love with that one. Amie, what's your favorite?
Wait, I want to hear what your favorite is. Avery, you sounded like you had a different favorite.
Avery's in love with the Van Meter visitor.
Stop. I was a Tumblr kid. I've said this a lot, and I grew up on the internet, and the big one on the internet is Mothman,
Yeah, sexy
Oh.
Mothman
sexy Mothman.
for sure.
Love that guy. Love
Yeah.
the internet lore.
Love his big arms,
Love his big arms and his glowing red eyes.
those
and-
nasty fanfic that I haven't read for sure.
Wait, is Mothman the reincarnated Van Meter visitor?
Could be.
Mothman saved lives though. Van Meter
Yeah.
visitor just like looked at people. all
How do we know,
menacingly.
though? I mean,
Mothman saved lives. It's documented. He saved a bunch of folks from a bridge that fell.
but it still could be the same one. I mean, the Van
I
Meter
don't- I think
visitor didn't kill
they-
anybody.
They looked a bit different. The Van Meter
Oh.
visitor was like a more bat-like pterodactyl looking thing. Mothman actually looks like a moth.
Oh,
He's a little bit softer around the edges.
maybe a...
And softer around the eyes. Am I
Mm.
right? Am I right?
We love a vigilante.
Amie, what do you like? Do you have a favorite?
No, I don't really know what a cryptid is. Is it just like an urban legend creature type of thing?
No, they're very real creatures that just happen to be best documented in urban legend.
I don't have one. Wait, Loch Ness Monster, for sure.
Oh, that's a good one. There's a Scooby-Doo movie about the Loch Ness Monster. Check it out.
My favorite is, of course, the hodag. Are you guys familiar with the hodag?
Mm-mm.
Nope.
Well, according to legend, when Babe the Blue Bull, you're familiar, Paul Bunyan's
Yeah.
steed, Babe the Blue Bull
Blue
died.
ox.
Okay, we're saying the same thing. Is those not the same
Nobody
thing?
calls it the bull.
No.
Babe the Blue Ox.
Yes.
Is that a better name than Babe the Blue Bull?
It's the name, so...
It's 3 B's.
That's the name. The
Babe
name
the
is
Blue
the name.
Bull.
the name is-
Alliteration, folks.
If you're from Minnesota, please write in.
If you're from Minnesota, don't at me. When there was a day when Babe the Blue Bull died, and there was a funeral pyre where his body was burned, and an evil spirit was released from the pyre. That spirit was the hodag, a creature that subsists on the bodies of English bulldogs solely.
What?
Don't at me. Google it.
I googled it. It's yep.
Oh my gosh.
She's real.
Where did this originate?
Minnesota.
This is also... because Babe the Blue Ox obviously died in Minnesota.
Allegedly.
Allegedly ox, you mean?
Allegedly ox. More likely blue bull.
What's the difference between an ox and a bull?
Well, an ox is
That's
a
a good
different
question.
creature entirely. Cattle Association, don't at me.
Yeah, I think a bull is just like a generic for, it's like a gender nym, right? For like the sex of
Yeah.
the bull.
There's
A bull is like a male cow.
Right.
But then there's also differences in like
whether they've
if
been
it's like a dairy
castrated
cow.
and things.
Yeah.
I like that we're leaning into the the great podcast tradition of wildly talking about things we don't understand. I'm like a huge fan of this. Now that I've made Bait was let's count them. Babe the Blue something that I said with my full chest. Ox versus bull. That's a really good one. And of course our fourth story. Iowa Democrats filed a bill last week minimizing their fellow legislators' abilities to cash in on money and power in their positions. I put together this explainer on TikTok.
The first bill would prohibit members of the Iowa Legislature, their legislative staff, and the immediate family members from trading stocks based on non-public information they learn from their official positions in the legislature. If that sounds familiar, it should. This is Iowa's version of what Congress has been debating for years, stopping elected officials from using insider information to make money in the stock market. Here's Democratic State Senator Zach Walz.
So if you know that a certain amendment is coming or that a bill is going to be filed that could have a very large impact on the movement of a specific stock price, could have a really major impact.
Take, for example, the so-called Cancer Gag Act, an Iowa Republican bill that effectively gives pesticide companies like Bayer and Monsanto immunity from lawsuits brought by Iowans injured by their products. You, an Iowan with respiratory issues from the use of Roundup in a nearby field, under this bill, Bayer would be off the hook. Not good news for you, but it's great news for Bayer shareholders. Here's Democratic Senator Sarah Trone-Garriott.
There are just too many opportunities here at the Iowa Legislature for elected leaders to cash in. So when you look at protecting big chemical companies from liability, I mean, that's another piece where it's about protecting shareholders, and if you are a shareholder, yeah, boy, that's pretty self-serving.
And if they use insider information to trade, there's a penalty for breaking the rule. It's a steep Class C felony, which means up to 10 years in prison and fines between $1,300 and $13,000. Plus, they'd have to give back any profits from illegal trades they made to the state's general fund. The other bill I wanted you to hear about, also pushed by Iowa Democrats, would put term limits on state legislators. Right now, an Iowa can serve in as many terms in the legislature as they can get elected to. This bill would add a kind of soft limit. They can only serve 12 consecutive years in the legislature. In order to run again, they'd have to sit out at least 2 years. In the Iowa House of Representatives, politicians could serve a maximum of 6 terms, and senators could serve 3 terms before hitting that limit.
Both this insider trading bill and this term limits bill kind of was released in the same package, and it's kind of oriented towards kind of presenting a better, kind of a good government platform that Democrats, of course, have historically been fans of. And it seems popular, right? If you go on social media, you see how well these posts have performed, right? I think there's a real hunger for a conversation about term limits. Have you guys been seeing similar stuff on the internet?
Oh, for years, for decades.
Right.
For centuries, I'm sure. People don't want, people to just want to get into office and then stay there and stagnate and forget about them, because we've seen this over and over and over again. People have said this about Grassley for decades, right? Because he's been there for a long time. Anybody that's been there for any amount of time can get that going. Now, Grassley's answer is always, well, I get reelected. That's the point of elections. People can decide if they want to keep you in or not. You don't need some arbitrary limit to tell you when not to. But we know that once you're in office, you have that incumbency privilege. And that basically means that a lot of lower information voters, so voters that aren't getting news constantly fed to them, sort of think, okay, you've been there, my life's all right, I'm fine with you staying there, and they get reelected. So in that environment, incumbents have a real advantage there. So a term limit would take that advantage away, presumably, sort of like we have for president.
Avery, what's been how do you feel about term limits? Is that something that you're a fan of?
I mean, it's pretty low-hanging fruit for my generation on the internet to call a politician old. Like, it's pretty, and it makes a lot of sense to me from like Amie said, from kind of the sociological standpoint of it, there's a lot of people out there that are low information voters that just kind of choose something on the ballot that they recognize.
Right.
And not that should be like the sole decider of having term limits, but I also just think it makes sense when like a politician represents the population of where they are. So in Chuck Grassley's I don't think there's a lot of people today that are older than chocolate chip cookies that are still working. Like, I don't think that, and I don't think it just makes sense to me that people who are just more keyed into what the average individual is experiencing today,
that part
should be representing those people, and not somebody who, is older than chocolate chip cookies. Like,
Well, and remember when we were also talking about a mental fitness test, right? I mean, that was a thing for a while.
Totally.
So, I mean, I think a lot of people are just dissatisfied, frustrated that they're not seeing their concerns and wanting some sort of recourse.
And another thing is, if you can make a career out of being a politician, it kind of negates what a representative is supposed to be. Like, you're not supposed to be profiting or making money or necessarily establishing like a livelihood off of being a politician.
Right.
You're supposed to do it out of the knowledge that you can represent your people. And so if you can be a career politician, it kind of negates the original meaning of what representatives were supposed to do.
Yeah, I think these are all concerns that you hear as anytime something happens that you don't agree with, right? I think the one of the like really common refrains is like, we need to do something about like this kind of entrenched power. We need to do something about these career politicians. So much of our politics does rely on people at the table having a sense of how a process works and kind of the history of these processes and these competing interests and like what have we tried and what haven't we tried and why haven't we tried that, right?
Sure.
For our cornhole matchup this week, we're going deep on term limits. One of my favorite political scientists joins us to explain why she's skeptical about whether term limits would fix us. That's coming up on Cornhole Champions. Welcome back to Cornhole Champions. I'm Zachary Oren Smith. Term limits draw a line in the sand for how long a person can serve in office. From the presidency to Congress to the Supreme Court, the question of how long someone should serve in office touches on fundamental issues of representation, expertise, democratic renewal, and ultimately power. Some states have embraced term limits for their legislatures and governors. Meanwhile, across our federal system, we have a patchwork approach with presidential term limits established after FDR's 4 terms, but no limits for members of Congress or Supreme Court justices. Look into any problem of the day, housing shortages, food insecurity, political gridlock, and you will find someone saying that if we could only get people to serve a limited amount of time, these problems would go away. It's this panacea that we turn to year after year. This hour, we're going to talk a bit about why this idea is popular and why there's some skepticism about what its ultimate impact would be. I have on the line here Megan Goldberg. She's an assistant professor of American politics at Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa. She studies state and local politics, electoral dynamics, and how candidates navigate challenging political environments. And today, she's going to help us learn a little bit about her, kind of why she and some other political scientists bring some skepticism towards term limits. Hi, Megan.
Hi, happy to be here.
Glad you're here. We saw there was a big push. I've been kind of like trying to read around about term limits. And there was a big push to get congressional term limits in the 1990s. Now we're seeing renewed interest in some limits on the Supreme Court. Senate Democrats here in Iowa have proposed limits on state legislative seats, saying that adding a little bit of turnover could serve us well in terms of how we approach our politics. What drives these kind of periodic surges of public interests in limiting how long officials can serve?
Yeah, so I think that they come up every so often at a point when sort of satisfaction or disapproval of Congress altogether is really, really low, or if it happens to be low in a state, or because as if you've sort of looked around or talked to other people ever, it's a really popular idea. And so if you're electorally challenged, it's like a softball, right? Like, I'll take it. So we sort of see it in political science as like a much later sort of offshoot of the 1920s progressive movement, where sort of in general, it's a social movement push towards more democracy. But to sort of like previewing a lot of what I'm going to say, political scientists often talk about like the failed promises of the 1920s progressive movement, that it didn't actually make things more democratic. In part, that's because the incentives of progressives in the 1920s were not always sort of like as pure as we think of them today, or maybe they were like too pure because it was also about race and immigration and being anti-immigration. Um, but like you said, there was this sort of huge push in the 90s where it picked up steam. And the other part that's really important is that in most of the states that have term limits on state legislatures, they've been passed by ballot initiative. It's really, really hard to get a legislature to limit themselves. A few have. But the good thing about this happening in the 90s and it now being 2025 is that a lot of these term limits kicked into effect. Like they actually started kicking people out of office between like 1996 and maybe like 2012. Which means that we have like 10 years of it happening in some states. And because there are 50 states and there's this like patchwork, we have a lot of methods to sort of compare what happens in one state with term limits to other states without term limits. And there's a lot of like, if any of your listeners are sort of like science people or statistics people and you're like, well, you can't compare states. The good news is like we do have a lot of really, really strong methods. And so this is like coming from like cutting edge, very good political science research.
This isn't some phenomena that like we have to guess a lot about. We've seen it in practice. We can kind of study these impacts, right? That we have a lot. There's a good variety of evidence to begin making sense of what this policy does in our world. Is that I'm hearing that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. There's actually a sort of new update. California, which has term limits, has worked with some political scientists to sort of be like, here's the lessons we learned. And sort of like looking back, right, are there ways that was via popular initiative, so changing it might also require that, right? But here are like the lessons we've learned, and this was like put out through a joint effort of political scientists, and basically they're like legislative services agency.
Before we get to like kind of what we've seen over time, I want to start with like why some of the arguments for why term limits is so popular, right? When you poll it across the general public, and one of the explanations of it that I've read about was they call it conflict theory, right? This idea that rival political coalitions might support term limits because they fear the other side gaining too much power through incumbency, right? The argument is that you institute a system of term limits because with the notion that while you may be in power today, right, you may be tomorrow's political minority, which is like a notion of that, like it's a kind of a long game thought for why it's important to put some limits on dominant political forces. What do you make of that as like kind of an argument for or against?
So I think that's a really strong argument, especially why you get some legislators supporting term limits, right? As we've seen in the Iowa Democratic Party over in the Senate side, right? That's where this proposal has sort of come from, although there is one in the House too. Often comes from, if you're going to see it, maybe minority parties, right? One, because of this idea that it might, if you view the other party too as like very entrenched, that this is a way to sort of unentrench them and unseat them. And maybe sort of upend the incumbency advantage that's keeping that party in office for longer. Among the general public, I think a lot of it comes down to this, like what we call the paradox of congressional approval. But this like trickles down to like any like legislative body, is that overall, we look at something like Congress or the state legislature and we judge it as a whole based on how well we think the process works. And so when we hear about really messy stuff, like when we see how sausage is made, our approval goes down. And so right now, congressional approval is like actually weirdly high in February of this year. It's like 29%. And I was like,
29% is
high.
Historically high.
There was at one point, I think, that in like the last decade or so, that Congress was at 8% approval. And I one time tried to back out the math that could you get to 8% of the U.S. by just adding up like their grandmas and grandpas. Well, they are grandmas and grandpas, so like they don't have grandmas and grandpas. But like, if you just take their wives and children and spouses and their family, does that get you to 8%? We're the only people who like Congress. But then if you look and you ask like, okay, you don't like Congress, that's fine. Do you like your member of Congress? Right. And all of a sudden, 50% of people, 60% of people are like, yes, I love my member of Congress.
Interesting.
Because you judge your member of Congress based on how they serve your district, not how Congress goes as a whole. And so it's like this like collective action problem that we all keep screwing each other over by electing our member of Congress. So this is why I think that term limits are so popular in the public, because you're like, this is a way to get those other people out. I might even like my own person, right? And this is like, there will be people who will say, I think the Senate is too old.
Right.
And then they'll turn around and vote for Chuck Grassley.
Totally.
They like Grassley. And it's different when you're like, he's the oldest.
Well, he may be the oldest, but he's our old. So,
he's our oldest. Yeah, it is this like, but that's my member, and they're fine.
Yeah.
And so I think term limits are this like, instead of, because to do what term limits could do, which is start to chip away at the incumbency advantage, very mechanically, like you don't have it at some point.
Totally.
That we could do this instead of all sort of working together collectively across geographic boundaries to change Congress.
Okay, so taking a pin out of what you were saying about the kind of like body of evidence that of term limits in practice, what have we seen across the nation? You want to point us to some episodes over time?
Yes. So like I said, these have gone into effect so they were passed in like over 20 states throughout the 90s. So one of the most important things, I think, before we talk about even like the sort of more direct effects or even the indirect effects, is that term limits don't always hold up in court. That there are several states that the courts repealed them, saying, and that's usually has to do with the relationship between term limits and the state's constitution. And so that's why it's only happened in some states and not others. So sometimes the courts have stepped in. There were also times when the public via ballot initiative has passed a term limit, and the state legislature has come in and altered it, either repealing it entirely, which we've seen other states do with ballot initiatives, or I think one of the only times a state legislature term limited themselves was because there was a ballot initiative on the coming up that was going to be really short term limits, and they stepped in and they're like, we're going to pass term limits, but they were longer, in order to avoid like a worse outcome. And so they're sort of like, Iowa's interesting because it's coming from the legislature. It's forcing Republicans into this like weird situation if they vote against it. My secret guess is that it will die in committee and they will hope no one ever hears from it, or hears about it, right? It's like, that's always the hope with like a bill you don't want to vote for, but it's unpopular. Die of quiet death in committee. The lobbyists in the room hear about it and nobody else does. So that's the once you get them, right, there's still like other steps. But the other like most, this is, I guess, one of the things we say about term limits in political science is the one thing we can say about them is that they do work in kicking people out of office, because you can't get around them, right there. And this is sort of an open question. Sometimes you put laws into place and people figure out creative ways to get around it. And term limits are hard to evade. That's what we got.
2 years is 2 years, right?
Yeah, exactly. 2 years, 12 years, whatever. So that's sort of like the direct, or one of the sort of more important things, I think, first is that, if they pass in Iowa, right? Hypothetically, down the road, once it sort of kicks in, the other thing is that like it doesn't happen next cycle. Usually current members are grandfathered in and they sort of like start as if, even if they've been in for 20 years, it's like they're at year 0 and they start. And so it's like once someone gets term limited out, then they can raise it in the courts.
Right.
And so it's like, it can take a lot. This is not going to fix our problems next year.
Victory today, victory tomorrow. I like those odds.
So I think to start, I mean, we know so much about term limits. I think one of the good places to start is whether or not, so it actually kicks people out of office, right? But the big question mark that we try to study is then you've kicked all these people out of office.
Right.
What happens after that? Because the term limits don't answer at all.
Right.
And so one of the sort of first areas that we studied was whether or not it gave us legislatures that are more representative of the people, in terms of like racial and ethnic demographics, of gender, sort of like working backgrounds, because what we know about state legislatures and about Congress is that, right, they are whiter, they are more educated, they are wealthier, there are fewer women, and there's this idea that once you sort of kicked out people who had been in office for a long time, who it's primarily going to kick out older white men, and that you would usher in this sort of like new generation of leadership. But it turned out like legislators did not get younger. They did not get less white. In some states, and some of this there is like a little bit of mixed evidence, but a lot of what we think happened is that legislators were already getting more diverse, and term limits in some states seem to have slowed that progress, and in some states it sort of stayed the same. So, you know, California has more women in it now than it did before term limits, but it was already like the trend had already started. And so like it doesn't seem like it makes legislatures more diverse. And that's in part because sort of like overall one of the sort of mechanisms at work is that a term limit makes serving in the legislature sort of like less valuable. And if you sort of think about like your own job prospects, taking a job that has like a very permanent end date is not necessarily what you want, right? You want to be able to sort of control to whatever degree you can. And right, legislators have fickle bosses, as us. We're allowed to be, though. But
Fickle by choice, fickle by
Fickle by
distinction. Yeah, by the grace of God.
yes. But that's, you know, so it makes it less valuable. And so it's harder to get people to, especially if like, I think there's this vision in term limits, and you'll hear this from members of the Iowa legislature, especially maybe when they talk about the pay increase on the table. People who are against it often want to talk about having like a citizen legislature. And there's this like very beautiful, rosy idea of like normal people who understand what it's like to live life, rotating into the legislature, spending a little time affecting policy, and then they like rotate out and go back to their normal lives. But if you have like a normal life, if you like think that's not how jobs work, that's not how life works. I am not going to call my provost and say, I'm going to take a leave for 4 years. You deal with it.
Every spring, I have to say, for
go.
an undetermined amount of time. Hopefully,
I'll be back at some point.
Tell the students to, forgive me, but I can't be here to teach them about term limits.
But also, it'll only be 12 years because I'll be promoted out, so it's fine.
Well, you add on top of that. I mean, like you hear from people involved in candidate recruitment drives in the state that it's a really hard sell to get someone to decide to stick their neck out for this process, right? Particularly as we've seen races become more caustic, not just primaries becoming more caustic, but general elections become more caustic. The incentive structure, right? Like, I mean, even if you are that that the 10% that are willing to put themselves in the spotlight for an issue, you still have this like kind of like potential opportunity cost, right? That, well, maybe my current employer, future employer doesn't like this thing that I've supported, right? How does that impact my ultimate economic viability? How does that impact my future in a large way, right? And by having term limits in effect, right, you're saying that not only am I taking this risk, but there's also like there's a terminal point, right, where at some point I will not, whatever eggs I've put in this political basket, I can't actually take that. I can't. There's no cash out at the end of that, right? And I think that is like a challenge for someone trying to deciding whether or not to throw their hat in.
Yeah. So, and that ends up having sort of like, there's two different things I think that come out of that. One is that, it's already like there's arm twisting to get people to run for office.
Totally.
There's lots of sort of like, groups that have popped up to help with candidate recruitment, although a lot of those are also not necessarily recruiting candidates. It's that like, run for something like jumps to mind that
Totally.
It's sort of like if you're running, they encourage people generically to run. But like in Iowa, it is like I know the person in our district who works with the Democrats statewide to say like, here's some people in this district who can run. And then asks them out for coffee and says like, we want you to run. And what we know is that when parties and the party organizations like the IDP are the ones in charge of, but that, right, if the IDP is doing recruiting, so was the Republican Party, that when the party organizations are doing more of the recruiting, the parties get more polarized because the parties are recruiting more ideologically consistent and more ideologically extreme candidates, right? And so in your own party, like you might love that. You might love that you are getting like these like really rock solid Democrats. But that also means you're getting really, really intense party loyalist Republicans. And so what we've seen with term limits is that because all of a sudden there are so many more spots open, because there are fewer incumbents, you get more party recruitment and you get more polarization in legislatures that have been term limited, not less polarization, which is really interesting.
Because it while the candidates themselves aren't consistent, political forces in their careers, the parties are, and you're saying it empowers the party. It gives the power, ultimately the organizations of the parties more power to impact these decisions, to have these slate of candidates to say like this is our this is our D candidate. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And the other thing that we think maybe happens is that because I guess there's like two things here. One is like the loss of expertise, which I think we can get to in a minute. But the other one is that it's really hard to like imagine going into a legislature and then trying to go back to a career later. So one thing this does is like you actually can sometimes get older legislators because it's people who are like this is their last gig before they retire, or it is a retirement gig where if it's done in 12 years, like they're like fine. Then I can go golf after that. But the other thing it incentivizes is using it as a stepping stone to higher office. And so instead of getting, there's lots of folks who are in the Iowa legislature who've been there for quite a while. It's clear like they're not running for Congress.
Right.
And there are state legislators who do run for Congress, but there's over 100 legislators, roaming around the state at any time, and we're only electing 4 of them to Congress. And so we have people who like their political careers are focused on the state. But now it's like, imagine a state legislature full of people who want to run for Congress, like in the next decade or two. And so then all of a sudden the incentives are structured by not like, what do I do for the state right now, but what do I do to build my brand so that I can use this to like leapfrog up into higher office. And that's why you get right that you're like, I'm going to be like the party guy. Because then later also the DCCC will come in and help me, or the National Republican Party are going to come in and help me because I've been like a really good party loyalist.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about expertise here, because this is my favorite instance. If you during the session on a Tuesday, Wednesday morning, if you go up to the 3rd floor rotunda, it is just this cloud of lobbyists, right? It is people from everyone from the Cicero Institute to the Urban Cities Coalition, right? It's like it's everybody and their mother. They're on their phone. They're stopping legislators in their tracks. They're trying to they're doing their thing, right? One of the really compelling arguments that I have heard in the past against the idea of term limits is when you impose term limits, one of the things that you've created, right, is that by increasing the amount of turnover in a position, you're decreasing the amount of experience a person has in these chambers doing this work. The people that do not have term limits are this paid lobbyist class, right? This group of kind of issue-oriented folks who do understand the kind of levers of power, what needs to get pulled where, how subcommittees work, how bills can get snubbed, it empowers them and their expertise, their experience to kind of better manage some of the kind of newer legislators. What's your take on that? What have you seen in the field with that kind of expertise gap?
Yeah. So one of the things, and this is, I really, really like Sarah Trone Garrett. I think she's fabulous and a really great legislator. But I'm going to steal something she said about term limits. Is that
cool.
There's like too much entrenched power, and we need to get rid of it. And right, that's exactly the logic of term limits. But the problem is like entrenched power has to go somewhere. That like, right, I always like think of, there's this like bowl of power in the policymaking process, and like everybody is trying to get as much, or like, I don't know, this is a pie that like there's only a certain amount of it. And if you leave some pie out, like somebody else is going to eat it.
Mm-hmm.
That was like way too many metaphors.
Pie. It's a bowl. It's a bowl of multiple pies.
Yes, perfect.
We're taking pies out of the bowl.
But the thing is, like, if you leave power on the table, somebody else is going to take that power. And so what we try to see is like who takes it. And when you don't have sort of the expertise or the capacity, because you were still, I mean, I think any first term legislator will tell you that like it is so much to learn. And it's not just like there's a lot to learn about the process of like how do I write good policy? How do I work with other people in my party? How do I build relationships with the majority party if you're a Democrat to get some bipartisan? And I know like we like to hear a lot about the bills that are just like fully polarized, like party line votes. But if you like, right, you're at the legislature, you see them pass bipartisan bills all the time on a lot of things that still make a difference in your life. I just took my class there last week. And I don't know what is coming down the pipeline, but like, I don't know, there's going to be a vote on whether or not you can noodle to like catch catfish.
Totally. Which
don't
I
know what we're
support.
voting on that.
Which I support. I think that's great.
But there was bipartisan support for it, like in this subcommittee where there was not, or in the Natural Resources Committee, where there wasn't necessarily, right, there were also some more party line votes.
Yeah.
But just start to like build those relationships across the aisle that you're sponsoring bills together. All that takes time. And if you don't have time to do all those things, and you're like, you constantly have this like large class of people figuring it out, is that they are going to listen to other people more often. And so that's going to be party leaders. So this is the other way things become more polarized, is that the party leaders who are the most senior people, because, I mean, if we think about like, you know, I think the proposal right now in Iowa is 12 years. That's a decent amount of time to become an expert. But it means that, you know, the people in their last term are going to be the leaders, and it's sort of the party folks. And so you're listening to party leaders for what to do. So the parties are going to be more consistent. But you're also listening to lobbyists, because lobbyists know, I mean, even now, if you like, this is true in Congress too, that lobbyists specialize in a couple issues, and they have research. I mean, that's the benefit lobbyists bring, is that they do like research, and I know that like everyone, these are like my unpopular opinions, that I don't really like term limits, and I don't think lobbyists are like the worst thing for democracy, because lobbyists do, I mean, we think about like there's think tanks doing research, and they provide good information that policymakers don't have time to.
Right.
What are you going to do? Like run a water quality study yourself as a legislator? Like obviously you're not. And so they bring really valuable information, but you have to rely way more on that information. And you sort of have to like use way more shortcuts to figure out what lobbyists are sort of like on your team, even though they're all technically from like nonpartisan, right? We know that they're not. And so you just figure out what lobbyists on your team, and you listen more to them. You also don't have time to figure out how to write laws. So like lobbyists handily will write them for you. And so this is like, empirically, we do see that there is more like lobbyist power in term limited legislators. Like that's the punchline. Right. That's all the why we think it happens. But like, absolutely, lobbyists are more powerful.
Lobbyists are already exercising a lot of control in our legislature. I know the Representative Steve Holt's bill, it was the anti-homelessness bill that failed to clear the funnel. Was a Cicero Institute project, right? Written, you know, what's good is he's very clear that this was an idea that I wanted some purchase on, that I got with Cicero folks to help write up that bill. Okay, so we've talked about like kind of issues, kind of like structures, like kind of why it might be popular. We've talked about kind of some of the reasons why you're bringing some skepticism to the term limit pool. This conversation grew out of Instagram back and forth between me and you and the DMs. And you made I've been thinking about it, right? Why this is one of these issues where 95% of the public is in favor of it, but 95% of political scientists do not like it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And in trying to do beef up on kind of my reading on term limits, I did notice that groups like Cato Institute and Heritage used to be big fans of this, but they stopped writing about it. I had to go back into the 90s in order to find like kind of their white papers on supporting term limits. I wonder, for you, kind of bringing us to a close, right? Like when we're talking about what 95% of the public is being in support of this is because there's some issue, right? There's some sense that politics as is not sufficient for the task, right? That there's something wrong. And if term limits aren't the pro-democracy solution that we think it might be, is there a way to adjust? Is there a version of term limits that could get us closer to there? Or are there other policies that we've seen in other states, you've seen in other countries that has been something that has in fact done a lot for kind of increase the kind of democratic power of citizens.
Yeah, so I think one thing that a lot of political scientists have sort of, even in the last like 5 years or so, have shifted their thinking is like maybe a long-term limit, right? Like what the real problem that we have is often people, and when the public thinks about term limits, they don't want the people who have been in office for 30, 40 years, right? Could we think about like a 20-year term limit? I think the other thing that does for political scientists is like we worry about the proportion of legislators at any given point who are basically already lame ducks. When you're in your last term and you know you're about to be term limited, you behave very badly. Like this, we know. You don't show up to vote. You focus on fundraising if you're running for higher office. You just like don't answer. Like people stop staffing their offices to do like constituency service. And they like don't sponsor any bills. And so like we want to minimize the amount of time that you are basically, because if you want responsiveness, having someone who is going to spend a third of their time not thinking about their next election is not ideal. So we think like maybe longer, thinking about if you're imposing term limits, thinking about even like a shorter last term, because if you think like a 6-year term, then you have 6 years of legislating with no sort of democratic accountability at the end of it. And that's why elections are important. And I think the other thing that like we're still, political scientists still are trying to understand, this is like an embarrassing admission. Like we really don't know why incumbents are so popular, other than like name recognition. And we're like, yeah, like incumbents win all the time and we don't really know why.
I mean,
and
is it not just money and a name recognition? Is it not?
Yeah, it's money, but like, and well, actually, so what we think it is probably too is because like the idea of the incumbency advantage is so strong, that it affects candidate recruitment. That you can't get good quality candidates to run against an incumbent, because why would a good quality candidate is going to look at the writing on the wall and say, I'll lose that election, and they're not going to bother.
Incumbency power is a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's a little bit. Fascinating.
Yeah. So like thinking about ways that you can chip away at the incumbency advantage. So one of those problems is money.
Right.
Term limits don't make elections cheaper. Campaigns are just as expensive. But what could you do to make candidate recruitment better, and also start to chip away at the incumbency advantage in like a softer way, instead of just saying like you're not allowed to be an incumbent. And so one of those is like thinking about, and like some of these are pie in the sky proposals, right? Like public financing of elections.
Right.
We're not
there.
We're not even close to there, right? Proportional representation would be better. We're not even close to there. And so a lot of it too is thinking about ways in which parties can also do a little bit of a better job, instead of exacerbating some of these parties or some of these problems. Like what can parties do to help support better candidate recruitment, instead of sort of putting people up to basically be like a sacrifice in unwinnable districts? Can you put up like a good candidate and have a competitive race? Because that's also like what political science wants, is like competitive races in every district, meaningful choices, because all of that we think creates more responsiveness. At the end of the day, you want your legislator to respond to the people they represent. And so, thinking about ways to, and incumbents are so entrenched and so have such high reelection rates, right? It's hard. That makes responsiveness harder, because they're like, well, I'm going to win anyway. And so, and the other problem at the state level, of course, too, is that we just don't pay attention to state politics. And so it's even harder to get the incumbents out. And so that's the other thing. And now I'm like blanking when I'm trying to like picture my Iowa ballot. But some places the ballot will say who the incumbent is. And there have been some pushes to get rid of that, because like you don't need that extra information on the ballot.
Totally.
And so that's sort of like thinking more about, expanding the length of term limits, thinking about the length of an individual term, but also like what are other ways that we can solve the actual problem, which is that incumbents are really, really popular for reasons not connected to the policies they're passing necessarily. How can we isolate their popularity that actually corresponds to like things they do for you, instead of these other things that we think are driving their popularity?
I think that's a good place to leave it. Megan Goldberg is an assistant professor of American politics at Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa. Megan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Amie and Avery, what'd y'all make of Megan?
That's interesting about the consultant class, because I would have thought it was the other way, right? I would have thought that people staying in longer means that they're more besties with the lobbyists.
Totally.
So it's really interesting to hear that now they're just, because you're getting a fresh crop of folks in these places with term limits, they're being seen as the experts and treated as such. So that is interesting. I would have thought it would have been the other way.
I find that really interesting too. Not necessarily because I think it would be the other way, but I mean, that just kind of makes sense to me, though. Like, if you are in a position where you're deciding on these issues, but you don't know much about the issues, you go to the people that know a lot about those issues. Right. My friends and I this morning were talking about, I have a friend that works at a local nonprofit that plants trees around Des Moines. And so they do a lot with like forestry departments around the state. And she was talking about Cedar Falls's government, that there's a lot of members on like the city council and like in Cedar Falls government that will go to like the UNI like experts on issues that they are making decisions on, and they'll be like, hey, is this a good idea? And they're like, no. And so then they won't do that thing. And there's something that like a lot of people my age have been talking about on social media is like, you know, the anti-intellectualism of it all. Totally. Of not consulting people who know about things, not consulting scientists, not consulting trans people, not consulting doctors, not consulting actual like verified sources of information to determine if something is like a good piece of policy. And so that makes sense to me that is how things should work.
But I do think it's important. I loved having Megan on the show because she does come with this kind of like really, really cross-cutting thought on like kind of how this works in practice. At the same time, right, the popularity is still clear, right? People are upset with how things are currently working, right? I think what we have to do, I loved her at the end. She talks about how like, well, if we're going to do term limits, maybe extending out like how long it is. Maybe 2 terms isn't enough, but maybe 2 decades is, or maybe 1 decade is, or like where does that line sit, right? At what point in time do we, as a people, feel like we're both accomplishing some of this need for turnover that I think the popularity seems to suggest, but also, you know, how are we making sure that like folks that are in office like have the season to do the job with you know, a level of competence. That was another episode of Cornhole Champions. If you like the show, please rate it, subscribe, and share it with your friends. We really appreciate it when folks share us around. It does a lot for the show. So I mean it when I say it.
Our egos too.
Our egos love it. This is to the Amie heads. Make sure you're circulating. You're circulating the work. While you're at it, sign up for my newsletter at cornholechampions.substack.com and get these episodes straight to your inbox when they drop on Wednesday mornings. Cornhole Champions is a weekly podcast powered by Iowa Starting Line. This podcast is produced by me with music from Avery Mossman. Cornhole Champions is a proud member of the Iowa Writers Collaborative. We'll see you with a new episode next Wednesday. Until then, I'm Zachary Oren Smith.
I'm Amie Rivers.
And I'm Avery Staker.
Thanks for listening. I don't know what my cold open is. Fuck.
I thought you just spring it on us from whatever thought comes into your brain. Isn't that how it usually goes?
That is kind of how it usually goes. I just don't have any thoughts in my brain this week.
Real. That's real.
There's some crazy take that you have. I know it's been bouncing around.
What about your brunch take?
I'm not ready for that one. I'm not ready to lose all of my friends.
He's already been eviscerated by us.
You're not ready for the...
He wants to at least not think that we've prepared to eviscerate him even further.
I touched the flame and I learned my lesson. I touched the third rail, the true third rail of LGBTQ politics, which is
brunch.
You stay away from you can take my civil rights, but you leave me my brunch.
You're not taking our brunch.